Hello and welcome. My name is Anna Rosenbrecht, and I'm excited to be with you tonight. I want thank you to Dr. Sullivan and the Rowan in diversity and inclusion, and my mom Lynn, who is a student in Dr. Sullivan's class, for arranging this terrific opportunity for us tonight. This past May, I was the first woman with Down syndrome to graduate from Rowan University with a BA in radio, TV, and film from the Berkeley College of Communication and Creative Arts. My experience and education here at Rowan helped prepare me to start my own business, 47 Club Productions, which has led me to society and to strategy. In 2019, Dr. Judith Heumann received an honorary doctorate in Humanities from Rowan for her work around the globe in disability rights. Dr. Heumann has led civil rights protests and sit-ins. She has been co-founder of Disabled in Action, the World Institute on Disability, and the Independent Living movement. She has performed on Broadway and given a TED Talk. She is an author, not just of her memoir, but she helped draft the Education Act. Dr. Heumann has served as an advisor on disability and development, as a special advisor on international disability rights with the department. She has been featured in 3 documentaries, most recently Crip Camp. She is also on several boards such as the American Association of People with Disabilities, Fund, and several others. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Dr. Judith Heumann, a woman who has helped make this world more inclusive and more accessible for everyone.
So, Dr. Judith Heumann, would you care to address us?
Sure. What I'll do is give a little bit of a presentation, and then what I really prefer to do is to engage in discussion. So I don't know if anybody's been designated as a moderator to ask me questions, but we'll do it this way. So I am a 72, almost 73-year-old white disabled woman with maroon glasses and brown hair, which is under my ear, and I'm wearing earrings that are black with white flowers in them, and I am wearing a pink and black top, which goes with a suit jacket, which I just took off because I can't stand wearing them. And I'm in the foyer of our apartment, and I have various photos and other memorabilia from my family and my husband's family, and that's where we are. The door may open, people may come in. I don't have a separate room to go to. We have a 3-bedroom apartment. My husband and I are in 1 bedroom. And I have 2 people who live in the house who help me in the mornings and evenings and on weekends. So I guess a little bit about my background. Anna Rose did a great job of reading that bio. Sorry, it's so long, but it's only because I'm older. And I think, how many of you have seen Crip Camp? Okay, how many have heard of Crip Camp? Okay, any of you read the book, my book? Okay. And all of you who I can't see your faces, see if you're willing not to be shy and come forward. Anyway, Crip Camp, I think, is a film that many of you would actually like if you're interested in disability rights related issues. And it is a documentary that is being distributed through Netflix and was produced by the Obama Higher Ground Production Company. And it was directed by a gentleman named Jimmy Labreck and Nicole Newnham. Jimmy is in the film himself. He's a disabled guy who, at the time that, when you see the film, you'll see that there is footage from 1971, which is one of the, I think, very interesting parts of the film, that there is about a third of the film is focusing on disabled people's experiences at this camp called Camp Junaid, which was in Hunter, New York. And what I think is really important about the film overall is that it's really documenting an important aspect of what has gone on in the U.S., namely the growth and evolution of the disability rights movement. And Camp Junaid, one of many camps, but what was very fortunate about Camp Junaid is that in Hunter, New York, in 1971, there was a new company that had been set up by 2 young men who were doing video work. And they had come to the camp and offered to train some of the campers in using the video camera. And Jim Labreck was one of those 15-year-old kids who later on became a sound engineer and then a director in this film. But he was one of the people who was going around filming at the camp, including this really great roundtable discussion from disabled teenagers about experiences in their life. And a lot of what they showed was a period piece of youth talking about their families, and it was people with various degrees of significance of disability. So talking about issues around autonomy and overprotectiveness of parents. And I think it's a very meaningful part of the video, but it also really portrays life at camp, how we were, learning, having fun, and then follows a number of the people in the film and the trajectory of our lives and how many of us became activists. And it focuses on a piece in history called 504, when there were demonstrations in 1977, which were started by an organization called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, which was a cross-disability consortia that came together. The first one really, I think, of its kind in the US. Unfortunately, it only lasted about 7 years. But nonetheless, it showed the importance and strength of a cross-disability movement, being able to really focus on trying to get this very important set of regulations signed by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1977. The film itself and my book really allowed people to get a glimpse into what life was like for disabled individuals from the 50s through today, allowing you to see experiences when we didn't have laws in place. And, you know, for example, my mother took me to school and I was deemed a fire hazard and unable to go to school until I was in the 4th grade, and then only able to go to segregated classes. And so you really get an understanding of where we were, work that was done to get the 504 regulations in place, the struggle to get the Americans with Disabilities Act in place, and the progress we've made, how we've made it, and what more needs to be done. The film is much more interesting than what I've just said, but I'm giving you kind of a nutshell. I think it's the film itself was shown at Sundance. It was the first film actually shown this year at Sundance, and it showed, I think, about 10 times. And I was there for about 4 or 5 of the previewing, and there were thousands of people who saw the film at Sundance. Most of them not disabled, like vast majority, not disabled individuals, people who really knew very little about the disability rights movement, and I think left the film feeling like, why didn't they know this story? And I think that's one of the most prominent comments that we get from non-disabled people and even disabled individuals who are younger and didn't live through that period of time, not knowing about much of what had happened at that point. And of course, this film is like a slice of a part of what has gone on. And I think that's what's important to realize, that this documentary, I think, is an excellent documentary. Hopefully, it's going to be nominated for an Academy Award. At the end of the day, it's only a part of the history. And so I think what it really also speaks about is the absence of disability in the media and of disability and the misrepresentation of disabled people in the media, and how that really continues to make it more difficult to get the broader society really understanding issues like inclusion, like what is segregation, what are institutions, quality of life that people, have been able to live, in spite of having some very important pieces of legislation, like the IDEA, like ADA, like 504, like numerous other pieces of legislation, which clearly have made important changes occur in the United States and has been a model for other countries around the world. But that being said, I think when we look at discrimination based on race or gender or sexual orientation or disability or religion, these forms of discrimination have, as a rule, been evolving for centuries. And so it's not that one can kind of snap their finger or produce a good course that would enable people to understand history, what oppression is, the kinds of oppression and discrimination that people have faced, and ultimately what we need to be doing to make some, in my view, pretty significant changes in order to be able to address issues of racism and ableism and sexism and homophobia, on, because we're needing to really, at a university, I think many people understand this, and I don't want to just say that only people at universities can understand this, but for those of you who are at universities, either as teachers or as students, you're there for a purpose. You're there either to teach, you're there to learn. And what I'm hoping is, people are being taught and learning information that can really help transform our country and the world. And yet, I think we can all acknowledge that there are dramatic changes that continue to be made at universities in order really to be able to consistently provide education and training that will be meaningful as people move, for example, into fields like education. When moving into the field of education, for me, when you look at the education of disabled children, when you look at the education of disabled children from poor and minority communities, and you look at the disparities that exist there, really, what is it that we're doing to address the current situation in order to be able to make some dramatic changes? And that can be said in the environment, in urban planning, in housing, and disability is still not a meaningful part of the discourse of what we're learning. So I guess, for me, I've been very fortunate to, when I was growing up, it really wasn't the norm at that point that women saw themselves as getting jobs and working throughout their life and maybe getting married and having kids. That was not the typical trajectory. It was maybe you'd get a job and you'd get married. Maybe you'd go back to work at some point. That's completely different today. But for me, as a disabled girl and young adult, my family very much spoke to me about that I needed to study. You don't know if you're going to get married. You need to be able to economically support yourself. And that was a very important message that I got. And also one of the messages was, you got a job and you typically stayed with that company for the rest of your life. And of course, that's another thing that has dramatically been changing. And I've been really lucky that I've had some really jobs that I feel have been very educational for me and allowed me to work with teams of people to be a little bit of the change that we're trying to make both federally and internationally and locally. And then working with nonprofit organizations that have basically been disabled people's organizations, both in direct services and policy work. So I think that we have more people who understand issues around disability. There are more disabled people that are identifying as having disabilities. But when you think about the fact that in the US, we're talking about 61 million disabled people, according to the CDC, you can see that our movement has not really gained the depth that hopefully it will continue to gain. I think another point that I want to raise is disability is kind of unique. And by that, I mean, we have so many different types of disabilities. And I think frequently, when one is identified as having a disability, you're kind of ushered off into the medical group that understands the A, diagnoses you, and B, may well be looking at medical issues that may or may not need to be addressed. But, you don't enter disability where the medical community will say, typically, this is your disability. These are things that you can anticipate. These are ways that we can help address your ability to enter or remain in the community. And certainly, there's not a lot of discussion going on about a disability rights movement that you're not joining. And here are organizations out there that you may want to join and participate in. That doesn't really still happen. But what we have seen over the last 50 years is, as I mentioned a little bit ago, more of a cross-disability movement that is emerging. And, when you look at the fact that most disabled people are not born with their disabilities, when you look at the fact that disability cuts across everything, Black disabled people, Latino disabled people, Asian disabled people, Indigenous disabled people, from the LGBTQ community, different religious communities, on and on. And and different types of disabilities, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, mental health disabilities. sensory disabilities, physical disabilities. And there's all types of prejudice that exists across all these communities against people with disabilities, against people of different racial backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. So there's a huge amount that we're trying to address. And I think one of the important parts of the disability community is that we really are working towards trying to look at the breadth of the movement. And I think this very important work that's been going on over the last number of years, where racial minorities not minorities necessarily anymore in certain circumstances, but racial diversity, people with disabilities from different backgrounds, are really taking a more prominent role in what's going on within the movement. And I think that's very important, to be able to bring the voices of people forward who can also represent not just our individual aspects of our lives, but really be able to reach out to others within communities to enable them to see that it is important that we use our voice, that we feel proud of who we are. And the reason I use the word pride is because I think if you feel good about who you are, you also are more able to really speak up and out individually or collectively about the existing problems and the kinds of changes that need to happen. I would say that, as much progress as we've been making, and I do believe that we have been making progress, we still are not at the level that I hope we can become more in the next 5 to 10 years. We are also seen as an intergenerational movement, where older people who are acquiring disabilities acknowledge that they have disabilities, where we can be working together with non-disabled people in their 30s and 40s to allow people to understand that disability is a normal part of life, and that if your objective in life is to be able to live in your community and not live in a nursing home or another form of congregate living, where we can see from COVID the huge percentage of people that are dying in these situations. If we can get people to buy into this and see themselves as having the possibility of acquiring a disability, and looking at the lack of policies and budget that is causing people to have to be living in these situations, and get included and work with the disability community and learn from us, I think that we can also be looking at making some fundamental changes, which also will raise all ships. If we can come together and really recognize what we have been doing wrong and changes we need to make. So I think the book and the film speak about a number of these issues, and maybe now we can open this up for discussion.
Dr. Heumann, did you have a...
Call me Judy.
Okay, Judy. I'm switching this layout, and I want to do this one, I think. Did you have a section of the book you wanted to read, or no?
I can do that. Hold on.
I would love that. We would love that.
So I'm going to read a part where I'm about 8 years old in my neighborhood. I didn't use a motorized wheelchair at that point because there weren't many motorized wheelchairs. They didn't really come into more use until the 70s, 60s, a little more, but this takes place in the 50s. I think it was a beautiful sunny day, but it might have been cloudy. I don't remember. What I do remember was being caught up in my conversation with Arlene as she pushed me in my wheelchair, talking about what we were going to buy at the candy store or what we wanted to do later that day. We were pleased to be walking around the corner to buy sweets in front of Dr. Nagler's brick house, which I knew was Dr. Nagler's house because I'd been there with my mother for her doctor's appointments. We paused to cross the street. Arlene turned me around to lower my wheelchair off the curb, pushed me across the street, and then, once we reached the other side, she put her foot on the metal bar on the back of my chair, tipped me and the chair back, and lifted my chair onto the sidewalk. As we did this, a few kids came toward us from the opposite direction. They were walking slowly down the sidewalk. As they passed, Arlene shifted my wheelchair to the side to make room for them. We didn't know them and didn't pay much attention, engrossed as we were in our conversation. So I was surprised when one of the kids turned suddenly to look at me. He stood in front of me, staring down at me in my wheelchair. "Are you sick?" he asked me loudly. I stared at him, not understanding. "What?" "Are you sick?" he repeated insistently. His voice boomed. I shook my head, trying to clear the words away. I was still confused, but couldn't speak. "Are you sick?" he asked, slowing down words as if I were a toddler. The world went silent as the words reverberated in my head. I couldn't hear anything except those words. "Are you sick? Sick, 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 sick." I shrank down, frozen with confusion, wanting to cover myself up with anything to hide from that question. The boy's insistent eyes on me. "Are you sick?" he asked me insistently, almost shouting. Suddenly, I became aware of Dr. Nagler's house behind me, and my face turned a cringingly red, deep red. Does he think I'm going to the doctor's office? But he's not my doctor, I thought. I fought back tears. I wouldn't cry in front of everyone. I wasn't sick. It made no sense. I knew I wasn't. But then, why was he asking me that? I became uncertain of myself. Was I sick? I saw myself through his eyes, and the light around me shifted. Shadows emerged from the corners of my mind. Previously submerged words, thoughts, and half-heard conversations tumbled into the glare of a spotlight. In a blinding flash, everything in my life made a perverse kind of sense. I couldn't go to this school. I couldn't go to that school. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that. I couldn't walk up the steps. I couldn't open doors. I couldn't even cross the street. I was different. But I'd always known that. It wasn't that. It was the world and how it saw me. The world thought I was sick. Sick people stayed at home. They didn't go out to play or go to school. They weren't expected to go outside, be part of things, to be a part of the world. I wasn't expected to be a part of the world. Abruptly, I knew this to be true, as if the knowledge had already existed for years throughout my entire body. I felt nauseatingly humiliated at the idea that everyone else had known this but me. Had they kept it from me? The embarrassment settled in as a cold ball deep in my stomach, where I could feel it spreading into my limbs. Was it sunny or cloudy? I don't know. I remember Arlene was pushing me. We were going to the store to buy candy, and we were chatting. And I was a butterfly becoming a caterpillar. Now, do you want to open up the discussion?
Judy, this is Nadine. I interviewed in my dissertation, my work was interviewing activists in the marriage equality movement. And I asked them what did they feel caused them to become an activist? You've already mentioned that there were thousands of people, involved in the activism, in the movement you've led, maybe even more than that. In your book, you mentioned at the end, that for every name you had mentioned, there were thousands.
Right.
Do you have a sense of what gave you the impetus to activism, or what's given it to others?
I think it's probably the same thing that your research showed, which is, a feeling, and I think the film is an important part of this, showing kind of how we were evolving, but allowing disabled people to see that the barriers we were facing were barriers that many people were facing. And in the area of disability, I think one of the important aspects of what was going on is we began to use the word discrimination. So in the late 60s and 70s, and certainly moving forward, we really began to use the word discrimination, which I think was very important, because disabled people still are, in many ways, isolated from other people. We don't know other people who have disabilities, or many disabled people don't know other people. And as we were able to come together and share our stories, but equally importantly, not the stories of the moment. The stories of the moment are very important. Who am I today? What is my experience today? What was it yesterday? What would I like it to be like tomorrow? And recognizing that we as a community, and not just disabled people, but right now talking about disabled people, we are the ones that can help change the future. And we need to be working with all these other communities who are also trying to change their futures. And I think for me, it was the number of experiences of different forms of discrimination, being denied the right to teach, having to ultimately sue the Board of Education, many incidents over the course of my life and many people's lives. So, my story, one of the things that I have appreciated is people who've read my book and seen the film, how they relate to the stories, how people see themselves in these stories, and how they become empowered by seeing and reading this story and many other books and films that are coming out on disability. Although I think there are more books coming out around disability than we need to see more going on, both in documentary and then authentic representation in television and, across the board. So I think, for me, it's getting to it. I love the challenge of no. I think from a very early age, I like to turn no's into yeses. And I think, for me, it's, if you've seen my TED Talk, it's, part of it's funny. It's only about 20 minutes. And I give a number of examples of things that I've done where no's have been turned into yeses. And one of the ones I like to talk about is I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to California when I was about 25 to go to graduate school and to get involved with an organization called the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. And I lived there for about 18 years. In the middle, when I was living in California, we'd done a lot of work, did the litigation, buses were accessible. But I had been experiencing, I don't know if any of you know the Bay Area. I lived in Berkeley and I was working in Oakland, and I would take a bus to and from work. And the buses would frequently be a problem. The drivers didn't want to use the lifts. They had this complaint and that complaint. And I remember, a number of times when the bus would come by and they wouldn't pick me up. And I had kind of lost my Brooklyn spirit. It was like I complained, and then I was in New York with a friend for a meeting. It was a really lovely day. And we walked from her office to the bus stop. And for any of you who know New York, there are these intercity buses. And they were newly becoming disabled. So you would have to call and find out when the accessible buses were going, because they didn't run all the time. And the last bus left Manhattan for Brooklyn at like 6:00. And so I had called and they said I should take the 5:45 bus. So we had walked. It was nice, as I said. It was 5:15 and the bus came by and it was accessible, but the driver said I couldn't get on. It was too crowded. Then the bus came at 5:30, same thing. And then I started kind of like waking up and saying to myself, you're in New York and the last bus is at 6:00. So that was kind of like in the back of my head. And at 5:45, the bus that I was told to take came, and the guy told me I couldn't get on the bus. And he said that people wouldn't get off the seats that needed to be raised so I could get on in my wheelchair. And I told the guy to go and ask the people to move, and they didn't. And so I thought, looking at myself, you're a jerk. This bus is going to go and you're not going to get on it. And this is the bus you've got to get on. So I pushed my wheelchair under the steps of the bus so the bus couldn't go. And it was like this whoosh of power, because I thought, oh my God, so a cop comes over. The driver got off the bus. He's like calling wherever because he can't move the bus. And a police officer comes over and says, what's going on? And I said, these people won't get off of the seats and I need to get on the bus. And he went over and he went on the steps went into the bus and told them to move. And I got on the bus and I was so happy. I mean, I remember sitting there like smiling like a Cheshire cat. And I was smiling as much because I regained a certain part of my New York spirit, which somehow never left me in California, but kind of diminished, kind of La La Land, a land of whatever. And I realized, it's really important that we are always fighting for what we believe is right. And I hate to use the word fighting, but in many ways, that's exactly what we're having to do. It's like the no's that we get that are frequently so ridiculous and are really based on prejudice. And so that's kind of the way I've emerged. And I think that's not how I always felt. I mean, I think the way I felt when I was younger is like many teenagers, a little bit wanting to be invisible, which is what I think this part of the story talks about, being uncovered, people seeing. I mean, I used a wheelchair. Obviously, people knew that I used a wheelchair. But connecting the word sick, I think really very much spoke to, and even today, what people think about when they meet disabled people. They think about sickness. They think about people not being healthy. When people are sick, they can't contribute. And so, we come forward saying this is a part of who we are, right? My religion, my race, my disability, it is who I am. And, but we're still in way too many ways having to deal with people's prejudice, unwilling to even acknowledge it as prejudice in order to move forward.
You said at the end of your book, for we are our leaders of inclusiveness and community, of love, equity, and justice, which I thought was just an incredible line. But I have a question from the chat that asked that difference helps. The question is, difference helps us learn to do things in new ways. What should other activists learn from your movement?
I think we should get strength from all of our movements. I think we need to learn about how other movements have emerged, what the struggles are, and the successes are that people have benefited from. And I would say that what people should learn from the disability movement is the continued growth of the movement and diversification of the movement and the struggle that goes on with that. Because I think it's fair to say that even within our own movement, we're not necessarily accepting the way that we should be of people with mental health disabilities or intellectual disabilities. We've learned, like others, to be prejudiced. And I think there's, for many more years, a real sincere effort to, and you see this very much in the film. I think one of the important parts of the film, and many people comment on this, is the respect that exudes throughout the film with people who communicate in different ways, maybe because they have cerebral palsy or Parkinson's or MS or whatever it may be, and their speech may be different, or they're deaf and we use sign language interpreters, whatever. But I think the film really shows that we valued the people in the room, and we want the voices of the people in the room to be heard. And it's our collective responsibility to help ensure that we are bringing a growing diverse, not that the diversity is new, but that we are bringing the diversity to the table. And I think that's really true of many other movements and the journeys that they are traveling down. And being able, I mean, my feeling and many of our feelings is we really need other movements to recognize that disability is a part of their movements. Mm-hmm. And that there really needs to be a look at what biases exist that are really making people feel uncomfortable or not necessarily welcome. And I, can talk about, I'm a Jewish disabled woman, and all of those parts of me are important. In the Jewish community, I think it's very fair to say that, we've been acknowledging more over the last couple of decades that there are biases within the community that have prevented people from equally participating, and that there is work that's been going on to really address that. Now, are the problems and biases gone? Of course not. But I think what we've seen is a more open, honest discussion and more pausing and thinking and listening about what people are saying and what needs to happen. And I have friends, for example, from the LGBTQ community who will talk about how it's difficult as, people with different types of disabilities in that community, and how they're working on trying to get disabled people, really accepted and included. And that can be said across all of our communities. So yeah. It's a positive evolution.
I noticed in your book, I think in the Fight for 504, how very cross-coalitional you were in your organizing and those working with you to organize. And just, clearly, and you've highlighted that there are disabled people in all of the other movements. So we really need to keep that cross-conditionality there in our collective action. We have another question. Someone asked, how can someone become a better disability rights activist?
I mean, I think it's, how can we become more engaged with other movements? It's meeting with people, it's learning from people, it's listening to people, it's supporting what the disability movement and other movements are trying to advance. And it's also you're taking responsibility for the inclusion of disability and other diverse communities in like your job, in your school, in your community, with your family, whatever it may be. And it's, I think, incumbent upon all of us to be able to look at ways that we can have dialogue, to really have open, honest discussions.
Yeah. There's someone who said, it's my observation that many policies adapting to movements are reactive rather than proactive. She asked, do you agree? And what advice would you offer to the exiled? Do this. I'm not sure if exiled is the right word, but okay. So many policies adapting to movements are reactive or proactive. Do you agree? And what advice would you offer?
Well, they are reactive because they're being created because of a problem, right? So I think that's fairly true. We don't need a policy on something that isn't an issue today or tomorrow. So I think the issue is we need good policy that's reacting to the time, but we also need to be looking at what we want out of the policy. And in many ways, if a law is not appropriately financed and appropriately implemented, then its impact is going to be reduced. And so I think we need to really continue to look at why the laws were developed, what is written in the laws that enable us to really, when effectively implemented, make changes, and what changes are actually being made. And where those changes are not happening, is it because the law is too weak, or it's because it's not being appropriately enforced? And in many cases, I think, it really depends. But in some cases, you need to amend laws. In other cases, you really need to look at more enforcement and technical assistance and knowledge on implementation. Then I think it's also, it gets back to elections. Sometimes we're not going to look at making changes to laws if, in fact, we don't have the electoral bodies that will be favored to the changes that we're looking at making. And I think that's a very critical issue. In 1968, there was discussion about amending the Civil Rights Act to include disability, because it did not include disability. But the conclusion was that the Congress at that point, if we would have tried to amend it to include disability, would have tried to make other amendments to the law, which would have weakened the civil rights law. And therefore, you couldn't go in that direction, even if many people felt it was the right thing to do. So you really have to look at these various issues. But I think it's important that people learn about what good policy looks like, look at other policies that have been developed, look at the issue, as I've said, of implementation. And and I think when we look at laws like the ADA or the Civil Rights Act or any one of a number of acts, in the 60s, I'm sure most people knew about the Civil Rights Act. In 1990, when the ADA came through, the Americans with Disabilities Act, many people knew broadly what it was. But in the year 2020, not as many people really know what the ADA is. They may have heard about it, they may broadly understand it, but they don't necessarily know how to use it for themselves or somebody else. So this need of continually making sure that people understand what their rights are, even to be informing about policy changes that may need to be made, as I said, either in law or implementation. I don't know who asked that question, and I don't know if I answered it, but if I could see your face and you could go like this or go like this. Oh, was that you, Shalena?
Yes, that was her
question.
So we have another.
Is that okay answer?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
Shalena. Was that an okay answer?
Yes, it was a fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to mention that Shalena and I are in class with Dr. Sullivan, and she is truly one of your biggest fans. She was fan crazed the entire time about you coming. So I'm just going to call her out and let her know. She's a big fan.
Thank you.
So we have
to read the book and watch the movie.
Yeah.
And get the book to be used in American studies and looking at African American studies, Latino studies, on and on. We need to get disability into those curricula.
Yeah.
I think disability studies is very important, but we need to make sure in disability studies that we're also discussing race issues and gender issues, etc. And likewise in the other subject matters, we need to make sure that disability is also being included.
So, Judy, we have another question. The question says, we recognize a growing university neurodiversity movement, yet many of our neurodivergent college students and students, let me not miss it, with other invisible disabilities do not disclose their disability due to concerns about biases and repercussions. What are one or two key steps you can recommend we do as a university community to ensure students know they're recognized and respected along with other forms of diversity?
I would say it's not just the students, it's the faculty and the staff. What is very important is that when people believe that diversity is something that is not only, that is being espoused as being of value, but that people can actually see how that is being implemented in college campuses, can see from the leadership across the institution that they are listening to what students, staff, and faculty are discussing about what the barriers are, changes that need to be discussed, and where in the case of people with invisible disabilities, that there really is a discussion which allows people to see that, well, trust has to be built. And by that, I mean, if you've had a lot of negative repercussions because you have a hidden disability, comments that people may be making, experiences that people may have had where they do disclose and there's been something negative that's happened. All of those things do not, and they may not be happening on the college campus. They may well be happening in your home or in your community or areas that you're active. So trust, I think, is very important. And at the end of the day, it's ownership. So if many people on, in this case, a college university campus, feel that there are sincere efforts being made and that there is real listening going on and changes occurring, things will not change overnight, but that people can really measure the progress, see it, touch it, feel it. I think over time, those numbers can change. I was on a call yesterday. Let me see if I can explain this. So I was on a call yesterday, and I was giving some advice on a project. And one of the things that one of the women was telling me is that they had been working with another company doing data gathering around women, disabled women, women of different colors, etc., about their experiences in the workforce. And once they had collected this data, they were then doing subsets of meetings. However, they couldn't do it with disabled women because not enough disabled women agreed that they would come forward for a subset of discussions. And my projection is many of those women had hidden disabilities. They hadn't disclosed, or they had only nominally disclosed that, they didn't feel safe in doing this. And those are all kind of ambiguous words, but I find that as people with invisible and visible disabilities are more willing to come forward and talk about how their disability impacts their life. And in many ways, it's positive, things that we are able to do and problem solving that we do, but also to be able to talk about the, as I've been saying, the impact of prejudice and why it keeps people closeted. And closeted, fits many different communities. And certainly people with invisible disabilities, many of them are closeted. They don't know what the law says. They don't know that they have a disability and that they are covered. They don't know what discrimination is. Or if they do, they frequently are afraid of using it. And, when I worked at the State Department, we had a delegation from another country, and we were having lunch, and it was a served lunch, seated lunch. And when dessert came by, one of the men at my table said to the waiter, no, I can't eat that. And he said to me, I'm diabetic. And I said, well, you should have told us, because diabetes is a disability and we certainly can get you another dessert. And he said, oh, diabetes is a disability. In his country, diabetes wasn't considered a disability. In India, for example, and I was on a call today, the government still officially says 3% of the country has disabilities, when in the US, it's 22%. And they keep the numbers low by narrowing the definition. And in narrowing the definition, there are also huge percentages of people who aren't getting benefits as a result of their disability, or not really counted in the work that needs to be done. So, yeah, I think these are all issues that we continue to need to address.
I have two questions I'm going to combine. One asks, in what ways do you see capitalism contributing to the oppression of all people, including people with disabilities, and how should that be addressed? And there's a second question about the fight for justice for disabled people in regard to money, and how if you get more paid work, you might lose home health aid hours or services and to function independently. So capitalism and the financial issues of working in home health aid. And
I mean, I think the issue of financing is a critical issue. And again, it's not just for disabled people, but talking about disability right now and laws that exist that in my view are quite punitive, do not allow you to earn above a certain amount of money because you're at risk of losing your health care. Not so much now with the ACA, but you can lose other forms of financial support, which for people with certain levels of disability can really adversely affect them. So, for people who need more accessibility, you may well, for example, need to be renting a place, or buying a place that is closer to accessible transportation. And as an example, the closer you need to be to accessible transportation, very typically the rent or prices of homeownership are higher. And so people may well have, before you even talk about whether or not a person needs a personal assistant and other kinds of supports, before you even get into that discussion, looking at the policies, gets back to this other question earlier. Frequently, the policies that are also being developed, they're looking at costs. And so I would say, when looking at financing, it's very fair to say that there are great inequities in our countries around the world. I think the United States certainly has huge inequities where, not again just in the area of disability, but across the board, where we are not supporting people in getting health care, in having adequate money for food and for shelter and other expenses. And I think those are issues that as communities we really need to address. Discrimination against disabled people in communist countries is also very severe. And there may be some financial benefits that they may be getting, but segregated educational systems, high unemployment rate, et cetera, is prevalent in those countries too. So I'm a little less into using terms and more into looking at economic equity issues. And I think in the United States, one of the problems that I think exists in this country is we know very little about what other countries have. So we know very little, for example, about what does healthcare look like in other countries. Most people, even those who travel to other countries, don't really go and talk to somebody like, oh, what is your healthcare like? If you get sick, how much do you pay? And so, we listen to bits and pieces of what people are saying who don't want to have national health insurance. And because we're not traveling, we're not inquisitive when we do travel, we are completely unaware of our status in the world and how people completely, in many countries, have no understanding of why we allow a healthcare system like we do, or why we are continually bombarded with advertisements about medications. I have a friend who's from England, and they're not allowed to have those kinds of ads on TV. And here, it's like 90% of the ads we have are selling medications. So we are, at the end of the day, we need to be more informed. We need to be more proactive. We need to be demanding of our elected representatives that changes be made in our system. we need to understand budgeting more, and we need to be more equitable in the distribution of wealth.
I have a question here about asking, did you see the movie Peanut Butter Falcon? And
Yeah, I
if
did.
yes, what did you think?
I really liked it. Anna Rose, did you ask that question?
Yes, she did.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, what did you think about the movie?
I can actually relate to that. Like, I might be living on my own with one of my sisters, or just want to be another working business and keep going with my life.
Yeah, I thought the story was great. And obviously, the fact that the character himself had an intellectual disability, I thought was very powerful. And it set so many examples, really demonstrating that there are disabled people with all types of disabilities who are able to do all types of things. Some of us are good in acting, some of us aren't. But for those people who are, they need to have a chance. And that's one of the big problems, in media, that disabled people are not getting the chances or the training that they need to be able to be successful. So I really like that movie a lot.
Same for you as well.
I
Thank you.
have another question here from an emergency management major who says that disability studies is baked into some of his classes. But asks, are there any online or in-person classes that you would suggest, any resources you would suggest for someone in emergency management or the rest of us?
I would do a couple things. There's an organization called the World Institute on Disability, and the executive director of WID, her name is Marcy Roth, R-O-T-H. Marcy used to work for FEMA. She came in the Obama administration, and she basically set up a program within FEMA that was very much looking at emergency preparedness and disaster relief. And her email is, I think it's roth@wid.org. And go to their website. There are many different organizations that are working on this issue, but I would start there. I'm sure they can give you great links. And FEMA is also obviously continuing to do work in this area. And we'll see what's going to happen with the Biden administration, because I'm sure it's going to get a jump.
I'm going to ask one more question from the chat and then one more to throw the floor back to you for myself as we sort of wind down, because we're coming to 6:07. So I believe this computer has the right time. One of mine doesn't. So this question is, speaking of non-visible disabilities, mental health issues are becoming so prevalent, especially with the pandemic. Do we intersect mental health with disability, and how do we help support a mental health movement? And with that, another person said that, was there an age so she talked about her own mental health issues, and she said, was there an age at which you came to accept yourself, and how did your life change for the better? So, okay.
So first of all, mental health, people with various forms of psychosocial disability is definitely covered under Section 504, under the IDEA, under ADA. It depends on what the issues may be when looking at discrimination, but it is very important that our movement do a number of things. One, really continue, as I've said, being cross-disability, and what that means is working with organizations that are run by people who have psychosocial disabilities, helping people to understand and learn from each other about the forms of discrimination that people may be experiencing, and what kinds of supports are out there, how to get support from other people in the community. And when did I think it's something that has evolved. And that the reason I read that particular part of my story is because it was at that age that I really came more to the realization that other people saw me in a way that, while I knew it, I didn't really. It's in my family, in my neighborhood. I knew that I was different, but, you know, we did things in such a way that as kids, we learned how to accommodate. It was as we were getting older and adults were intervening that problems became more significant. And I think for myself, probably when I was at camp, that was important because then I was with, everybody was my peer. And, you know, I think we all pretty much, it was a space where we weren't different like we were in the outside world. It's not that, as I said earlier, and you see when you watch Crip Camp, you know, Denise Jacobson and Neil Jacobson, I think, speak very powerfully about, they both have cerebral palsy. And Neil's mother asked him, you know, when he got engaged to Denise, who also has cerebral palsy, I understand why you wanted to marry someone with a disability, but why couldn't you marry someone with polio? Now, I was a good friend of Neil's, and his parents and my parents were friends also. So I always kind of laughed about that and thought, was she trying to make a match between him and me? But of course, what one can obviously interpret from that is Denise also had cerebral palsy and also has a speech disability. And so looking and sounding more like the typical population is, I think, frequently what people are striving for. And being able to accept me and Neil and Denise and others accepting themselves, that takes time. And I think for me, it's really been being able to be with other disabled people where we are fighting for change and where we are seeing change happening, and feeling that that change is happening significantly because of our vision and our ability to engage not only more with disabled people, but with a broader community, which is what you see, as was mentioned earlier, you know, by Nadine, in the 504 demonstrations and others. It always, I think, comes back to, you know, there's the personal, who am I? How do I see myself in the world? How do I begin to respect myself? And everybody's going to go through that struggle differently, but having validation, you know, looking at television, reading books, seeing, you know, in journalism, in advertising, seeing people who look like us, or for people with invisible disabilities, obviously it's not the look, it's the expression. It's the ability to discuss whatever it may be that's going on, and feeling that it is okay for you to accept, and other people will be accepting you for who you are, whether you have depression or you are bipolar or whatever the label may be that you have, or you have lupus, or you have any one of hundreds of invisible disabilities. That's another thing. There's so many labels of disabilities. But yeah, I think, and having friends and family really be able to be there for you. And by that, I mean that I can feel comfortable calling and having a conversation, calling and having a discussion. And I think, you know, for me and many other disabled people, it's frequently needing to speak to other people with disabilities that are maybe similar to our disabilities. And in the area of mental health, there are more organizations run by people who have psychosocial disabilities, or whatever label you want to call it. And I think that's important. And I think also we have to recognize that, you know, people with mental health disabilities, it's something which really over the last 20, 30 years is being discussed more openly. And I think that's also very important. And again, getting back to this theme of media representation, really calling out when media representation is wrong, inaccurate, when it reflects something which is scary to people. That's where I think as a community, as a society, we need to really call out the makers of these messages and really demand more authentic representation, and where the broader disability community and other movements can also step in and be supportive of calling out discrimination and racism, et cetera, when it's happening.
And my final question would be, what's ahead for the disability rights movement? So there's been all of these gains and whatever pushback and backlash has happened. What do we as people who are interested in being part of and being supportive of, what do we need to know? What are the issues going forward?
Well, everybody will have different issues. So I'll give you what I think some of the major issues are. I think we have to be very concerned about COVID. We really need to look at COVID and its impact on budgets. We need to be looking at the fact that, on the one hand, such a huge percentage of people who are dying as a result of COVID have disabilities. People who have been living in institutionalized settings like nursing homes and congregate living. We need to look at what is going to be done so that we don't wind up with more people in segregated living programs. And the reason I'm saying that is, if we're not providing appropriate funding for people to be able to live in their communities, in many cases, it's not that it's cheaper to live in the nursing homes. It can be equally expensive or more expensive. But again, it's because as a community, we are not owning and supporting and fighting for these kinds of changes. So I think that's a big issue, because it brings up the issue of home and community-based services. And home and community-based services are not adequate in most communities. And so, they may be income linked, and so also retards people's ability to be able to earn more money than they in many cases are able to earn, because they can be losing benefits. I think also big issues are in the area of technology. We need to be ensuring that as technology is evolving, that accessibility, or what I think you call universal design, is being built into everything that's being developed. I think we need to make sure that people understand what their rights are. We need really organize. I think it's one of the big mantras that we need to be utilizing, and we need to learn, and we need to be proactive. Join disability rights organizations, see if you can volunteer, be on boards, help do fundraising. Look at who you are in your community. Do you know the organizations that are the most active on disability rights across different disability communities? When people are running for office, are you asking them what's your position on whatever around disability? Are you working with people in the community? Are you seen as an ally?
Judy, I want to thank you so much, and I want to echo some of what was in the chat of many people offering their respect and their gratitude for the work you've done and the work others have done with you across the decades.
Yeah, and I really want to say, what's very important is there are so many people that are working on this issue, and so many people whose voices need to be heard. And I think it's very important that we recognize the breadth of our movement. And because there are many people who've passed on who are very involved in change agents, many people today who will continue to grow to continue to be change agents. And so I think, we're a movement, and movements represent many people.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, to everybody still on the call, Judy's book is Being Human. I forget the subtitle.
Here, I'll show you.
There we go. And
Thank you,
Unrepentant
An
Memoir.
It's in the
Unrepentant
chat.
Memoir of a disability rights activist. You can get it at many of the local bookstores, which I really encourage if you're going to buy it. I really encourage you, if you want to get the book, that you go to, you can do it online, or call them a local bookstore, or you can get it on from Barnes and Noble or from Amazon. And if you want the audio, it's on Kindle, but if you want the audio, it's read by a woman named Ali Stroker, who actually is from New Jersey, living in New York. She's the first disabled wheelchair user on Broadway, and she won the first Tony given to a disabled wheelchair user for her performance in Oklahoma. And she's amazing. And she played me on Drunk History in 2018, and she's great. And and everybody loves her reading. So, and get this, maybe if you belong to a book club, get people to read the book. And, there are book clubs also of mother-daughters. I think it's a book that mother-daughters, especially teenagers, can read. And the book is going to come out next year in a young adult version. And it's also in February coming out in a soft edition. So.
And many of these things are in the link. So if you look in the chat, I've linked the book to the Penguin website. Also, there's a link to the TED Talk for Judy, and there's also some other links in there. So if you look in the chat, if you're looking for any of the links to her book or her TED Talk.
Nanny,
I would say for me, doing the Trevor Noah program in March was like amazing.
And people can find that on YouTube for sure.
YouTube, March 4th, Trevor Noah.
Yeah. And also Crip Camp and The Power of 504.
Yes.
And what's the third documentary? I'm forgetting the name of it.
Oh my God.
No.
Lives Worth Living. But
There it is.
unfortunately, Lives Worth Living, you can't get off of YouTube. They're still selling it. And that's because when they made the film, it came out in 2010, they had to take out like a $300,000 loan. It was shown on the independent lens, but they didn't get grant money, or not enough. So, but you can see the trailer on YouTube. I believe Lives Worth Living is going to be showing on the 17th of December on PBS. You might want to look at your PBS channels to see, but it is supposed to be showing in December. And that's another different documentary than Crip Camp.
And Judy, thank you. This has been such a great addition to the graduate program here at Rowan in diversity and inclusion. And our class thanks you for coming and being our class this evening, but also for speaking to our entire university.
Thank you.
Anybody want to say goodbye?
Thank
You can
you,
unmute
Judy.
yourself and say bye.
I'll see you again.
You're my hero,
Okay.
Judy. I love you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Judy. Nice seeing you again.
Yes, thank you. Was that John? Who said
Now
that?
it's Jay.
Was it-
Oh, Jay. Hi, Jay.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks for getting into good trouble over the years for the disability movement.
All of us. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks to you,
thank you.
Nadine.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you to Lynn. Thank you to Anna Rose. Thank you to Judy. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.